interested, among other, I mean, she's always interested in history. And she's essentially. And she's,
it's said in a way I'm not exactly sure how to take it.
Well, I don't just do sort of French construction, put it that way.
But she's interested also in local society and local cultures and so on and so forth. You know about Frank's first book, right? And then, but it comes in also in the most recent book, which provinces, but more in South Russia, Tiflis, you know, those societies, the Imperial societies of the non-Russian members. Anyway, are you ready for the
Excuse me?
Are you ready for the
No.
Okay. Anyway, so this is Frank Wcislo, who's professor of history at Vanderbilt University, and he's also, well, so in scholarly terms, he's known for the book that he wrote on local government reform, 1860s onward, which actually became sort of his thread to pull on the whole question of reform in late Imperial Russia and the so-called viability of late Imperial Russia. His second book was a very nicely written book also. He was just telling me about all the people who reviewed it. Steve Ford reviewed his book, right? And was it in Ford magazine? Yeah. Steve Ford reviewed his book. And understood it. But it was. Yeah, and understood it.
Yeah.
That was the part that really impressed me. And then Wall Street Journal wrote out, and that was on the life and times of Sergei Witte, going back to childhood in Tiflis, to South Russia, on to the imperial capital, and but less, you know, the economics had already been given to some extent. So a lot of what we're writing about was really about politics and culture and imperial culture, and it was interesting. Most recently, he's been working on the last years of autocracy, and by autocracy it means, well, you'll tell us about it, but we're talking about the whole system of government in the last 4 years. Is that right? 14 to 18? Yeah. And that I'd like to hear a lot of selfishly. But he's also been given a new task, which is the Dean of the Commons, the Dean of the Commons at Vanderbilt University. And his job is to give meaning to the undergraduate experience. Now we should probably really be listening about that too, your experience there. That's it. So Frank, just
okay. Well, so I thank you, and thank you all for coming, and I guess the anonymous audience that's out there as well. Yanni was kind enough to offer the opportunity to come to NYU and spend a week thinking about a new book project. And I literally feel as if I've been sort of craned out of one existence, sort of one of those old arcade games where you drop the crane down into an enclosed glass box filled with plastic balls, and there's that stuffed animal that you're trying to grab for yourself or your significant other or your kid and drop it down into another space. And so I was craned out of one world, which is extremely bureaucratic and also awash in undergraduate and teaching and other sorts of responsibilities into this one. We actually have had a good long week to think about a project that I've been working on for the last 2+ years at this point, but to try to think of it in more synthetic terms. So while I have a set of notes in front of me, I'm going to try to follow the spirit of the session and refer to them as little as possible, and kind of thinking my way through out loud for you this project. The invitation was размышления, basically sort of, you know, what in the Columbia tradition was also known as free association. With all its promise and pitfalls, I want to free associate about this book. And since I knew the graduate students here, I also want to actually take this on in the first instance of thinking about the problem of the next book, right? Which for you might actually, in fact, be the problem of qualifying exams in the dissertation, but eventually that is going to be the first book, right? And so the first set of themes that I want to sort of emphasize here from the outset is the necessity of risk-taking and embracing, and really embracing the unknown. So I finished a book on Sergei Witte, which actually was being written for a very long time. I'm also the father of 4 children, the youngest of whom are twin daughters, now juniors in college. And those are my 4 books in addition to the 2 books that I've actually written. And the Witte biography was initially conceived actually in the very late 1980s after I finished my first book. And it was conceived largely as a biography of a very significant statesman who also was the obvious analog was Gorbachev. In the process of putting that project together, which included a kind of a massive autobiography, memoirs that Witte had written, and the original manuscripts of which are uptown at the Botanic Archive of Columbia, the Soviet Union disappeared. And so, the reason to write the book in the first place, that is, well, he's a very significant statesman. So you should give me grant money to study this this person. That rationale disappeared correctly entirely. And so I found myself really having to reinterrogate the project, and ended up with a book called Tales of Imperial Russia, which really is in the boilerplate presentation, a Dirksian cultural analysis of the autobiography that actually allowed me through memory to actually excavate the landscape of late Imperial Russia. The society, culture, and really cultural tropes of a particular class in late imperial society, and for that matter, actually, ultimately a particular gender, man, a Victorian male in that government class in late imperial society, because Witte, it turns out, was an unbelievably spectacular storyteller, and it allowed me to really sort of walk through his life and his times, assisted by a historiographical revolution that had also taken place in our field in the 1990s, in part thanks to our colleagues in literature who were reminding us that there were other things to think about besides simply high politics and political statesmen. So when I finished that, you're kind of left with the question. It's like, okay, now what do I actually, in fact, write? And I found myself in the first instance left with risk-taking. Number one, embrace the unknown, with an assignment that Witte had kind of left hanging, right? So, I mean, of all the things that fascinated him in his autobiography, ultimately, given that he was this very powerful statesman, what fascinated him ultimately was power. And what really fascinated him about power, of course, was the central focus of power in the empire, and that was ultimately the royal couple. It was actually the Tsar. But really what fascinated him about them was not simply Nicholas, who afflicted him to no end, but ultimately the royal couple itself, Nicholas and Alexandra. And he found her to be an absolutely fascinating and ultimately unfathomable figure. And I found myself thinking, well, I know what I'm going to do, because I really enjoyed writing a biography, and I really enjoyed the writer's challenge of this kind of text. And thinking about a different audience than the audience that you write a monograph for. I'll write a biography of Nicholas and Alexandra. And when I first announced this to a mutual colleague of ours, Boris Semyonich, in St. Petersburg, a very distinguished academician in the Institute of History, who looked at me like I'd gone completely off my rocker. I was like, well, she's really boring. Why would you want to do that?
And he's contemptuous of her.
Absolutely. Like, she's an idiot. She's
intelligent.
Right, and so why would you want to do that? That really just seems ludicrous. And after a while, actually, in thinking about it, it was also, these people, in essence, they have a correspondence that dates back to their courtship, and it's correspondence and diaries and photography that ultimately would probably require a team of researchers and modern technology to actually analyze language, and I'm just too old for that at this point, and I just don't have the wherewithal of pulling that off. I was also a little afraid about, how would you ultimately, in fact, approach a royal couple and situate them in the context of an imperial court culture without which you couldn't understand them at all. Because ultimately it wasn't simply two people or a love story and all the rest. The notion as a sidebar of, in fact, writing this all as a novel and blowing off scholarship altogether is also, at my age, something that I find extremely alluring and is, in fact, possibly on the writing agenda. So everything I want to talk to you about here, it strikes me that it would be much more interesting to write a historical novel about it, but I get that graduate students are particularly uninterested in that.
Oh, is that true? Is that true?
Well, graduate students, I mean, I don't know if that's true or not.
Being professionally uninterested.
Professionally uninterested, although personally you might find it to be, absolutely much more alluring than spending your time doing monographic articles and whatnot.
Well, I actually think the genre of historical novel is incredibly interesting just as a genre. I mean, I look at sort of theories of historical novels, so I'm interested in that kind of interface. To me, it's...
All of what's here today, actually, in fact, it seems to me, could be done with possibly much greater effectiveness and reach a much broader reading audience if it were done actually as a novel. And in a lot of ways, the research that I've done, and I want to talk about in a bit, is probably actually, in fact, would be more conducive to that kind of narrative style than to a more scholarly narrative style, without question. And I guess, although I wouldn't have expected that this would be the outcome of the seminar, but who knows, maybe you'll convince me that I had to write the novel by the end of all of this. As I was thinking about sort of, well, if not Nicholas and Alexander or the Imperial Court, then what? And I stumbled on a book that by a really spectacular book, as a matter of fact, by a not a professional scholar, a British woman by the name of Miranda Carter, called George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm, Three Royal Cousins and the Road to World War I. In Britain, it has a somewhat different title. I think it's Three Emperors, Three Empires, and the Road to World War I. But it's published by Knopf in 2010, and what she does is that she looks at the extended family archive of Victoria and Albert and the 9 children and extensive grandchildren of this extended royal family that's intermarried across all of Europe, and examines from really kind of the 1880s until the end of the First World War, examines the family correspondence. And it, of course, was this really fascinating glimpse into the world of imperial and monarchical Europe that I just found stunning. That student yesterday who raised his hand in an undergraduate lecture and said, "What did I mean by monarchical? Did I mean imperialist?" And and I paused and said, "So well, they're not synonymous, but they do go together." And oh, by the way, I mean, if you think about Europe in the 19th century, do remember that it's a given after all. Right? I mean, the notion of republican and democratic forms of government in the 19th century just odd in most places. So I found myself actually thinking more broadly about this world that in this book, of course, disappeared and collapsed. And then I guess accident number 2. So as the Witte book was being reviewed, I had the good fortune of running into a guy named Sean Guillory. Sean has an online set of book reviews called New Books on Russian History. Do you know this?
Yeah, Sean online?
Sean's restaurant.
Yeah, but he also has this series of really interesting online interviews. And he somehow or another got a hold of me and really had done an excellent job in reading the book and in organizing questions that got me talking about both the book that I had written and especially an excellent job of getting me to talk about the book that I really hadn't written, that he kind of intuited out of the text. And one of the things that he asked me towards the end of the interview was, well, what was I going to do next? And he had me kind of caught in the crosshairs because I wasn't really sure. And I said, well, I'm thinking about Nicholas and Alexandra, but and ultimately I'm kind of interested in following a line of thinking that has been part and parcel of my academic career. So I mean, I basically am a social historian by training, who basically has learned has acquired some of the armature of the cultural historian as I've gone along in my career. But ultimately, my assignment might be a bit too much to describe the ancient environment, the Columbia environment that both Yanni and I come from. But my area of investigation was always bureaucracy. I studied with
social and cultural history of the bureaucracy.
social and cultural history of the bureaucracy, although I studied with somebody who actually was a labor historian. And, you know, in my seminars, at least my generation of the seminar was studying radical intellectuals and peasants and workers and revolution from below. And I and a second person who studied, Andy Werner, who studied Nicholas II, we studied bureaucrats in the state, which of course made us really oddballs at the time of that particular generational obsession with revolution from below. But it served me in good stead. The first book, I kind of took the beast to 1914 and then speculated and then afterward about what happened in epilogue, what happened between 1914 and 1917. And in the Witte book, he dies in, he has the good fortune, I suppose, of dying in 1915 and missing the chaos of the chaos that would descend certainly on his class in 1917. So I was able to actually speculate from 1915 to 1917 with a little bit more certitude because the source materials that I had allowed me to really look at Witte's committee work and politics even at the very end of his life during the war years, especially around questions of financing the imperial state and the war effort, the increasingly impossible task of financing the war effort. But I never got to 1917, and there is an old but very famous translated document by an old Columbia historian. His name is Michael Chernyavsky, called Prologue to Revolution, and this was a translated text of meetings of the Council of Ministers, that is the Imperial cabinet, from the summer of 1915, where you really kind of see a bureaucratic crisis emerging. And this was really taken as one of the key texts to think about, you know, the crisis of bureaucracy and the crisis of the state that would then explode in 1917. And those documents I knew were still at the Bakhmietev, Yakhlenkov is his name. So it got me thinking more, Guillory's question in particular got me thinking more systemically about the question of collapse and disintegration. I'd say that probably at the same time, contemporary events had me thinking this way as well. So I mean, basically, you know, you find yourself. This in particular for me happened with the Arab Spring, and Cairo in particular. So you find yourself wondering, all of 1989, 1991, the Arab Spring, you know, the events of the last several weeks in Ukraine. How is it that states not so much are overthrown? There's a whole library about that. But how is it that they actually, in fact, to use decidedly non-academic language, that they so badly blow? I mean, how can you actually possess all the levers of power, authority, administration, and violence, and allow power to slip through your fingers as easily as it in fact does? Now, you know, sort of as an aside, but I teach undergraduates far too much. In thinking about Ukraine, I found myself consulting the only authoritative source on American television at the moment, Jon Stewart in The Daily Show, and Stewart is showing scenes from Independence Square in Kiev of, you know, riot policemen, Berkuts swinging batons and sort of these masked demonstrators flinging Molotov cocktails and all the rest. Utter and total chaos. And Jon Stewart comes back on and gives the camera that look that he's so famous for, and he says, you know, the first thing I'm going to do when I become dictator is I'm going to eliminate all those squares. Right? But in some ways, you know, that also gets to the point. So how can all of this happen? How do these regimes collapse? And that for me was that for me, I think, probably in thinking about a project in the spirit of размышления, is really the first place that this book begins to take on some kind of semblance of reality in the back of my mind. Then another accident, I suppose, in what's becoming a bit too much of an autobiography. But still, Yanni mentioned that I'm a dean at Vanderbilt as well as a historian, and I'm a very peculiar kind of dean. I'm the dean of the Ingram Commons, it's called. And Vanderbilt has a freshman residential college where all 1,600 of our first-year students live in 10 house communities, each one of which has a faculty master. In fact, we can't call them masters in the South, so we call them actually faculty heads of house. And I live with my family in a home, a fairly large home actually, on the campus called ostentatiously the Dean's Residence. And this was something that was created in between 2006 and 2008. When I was appointed dean, it didn't exist, although it was being constructed. But all of the kind of conceptual armature and the best practices and organizational details of this had to be put together, and I played a really significant role in doing that. And it has been fun. And actually, while I was doing it while I was finishing the Witte book, and the back and forth between being dean and writing about Witte was itself a very interesting autobiographical exercise. But I found myself constantly engaged in questions of organizational success and organizational failure, and also constantly, although I don't read this stuff, constantly exposed to people who did and knew a lot more about the literature of managerial and organizational studies. So what actually, in fact, makes for a good organization? What, in fact, makes for organizational failure? What are the component elements of, we have an entire school at Vanderbilt of human and organizational development, which at one level seems to be an HR nightmare, but at a second level, if you think about it, right, there is nothing more fundamental. My son likes to remind me it's the reason that The Office is a hit television show in 20 different countries. There's nothing more fundamental to our human experience than the relationship between human beings in organizations. I mean, look, what is this if not that right now, right? With even these people participating as well. So I found myself thinking that well, if you're going to actually pursue an old academic action, bureaucracy, to its logical conclusion, but you don't actually want to write monographs any longer, and this still leaves on the table the question of the historical novel, so maybe we'll just blow all of this off completely. One way of thinking about a broader audience is how would you make something like this relevant to a reading audience that was interested in organizational and managerial theory? And would it in fact be possible to in fact do that, right? And to kind of indulge that that interface and that cross-fertilization that is, so much a part of the interdisciplinary and trans-institutional university that we all exist in nowadays, and that you all, will like it or not, exist in ways that we really can't quite yet imagine. And then finally, in terms of accident and good fortune, and that is the source material. So I mean, ultimately, what it comes down to for us historians, whether inside or outside the history department, is the actual source material that you have available to you. And and here, of course, the ability to actually, in fact, easily find what basically the July 1918 Soviet Constitution declared to be, the memoirs and autobiographies of Vichency, of people who basically were, deprived of their rights because when the world was turned upside down, rather than being on the top, they were on the bottom. Or of Witte, but they're especially in two places. One of them's uptown at the Bakhmiechev, and the other is on the left coast in San Francisco, in Palo Alto at the Hoover. And when you take the Bakhmiechev and the Hoover archives and you put them together, you really have, and I haven't quite figured out, Yanni and I were talking about this the other day, I haven't quite figured out the appropriate word for imperial elite here, but a set of subcultures and affinity groups inside that elite that includes the high society imperial court royal family I'm teaching on a Karenina right now to undergraduates, and it's really interesting reading on it and finding, you know, sort of like the intersection of high society and the imperial court. And the undergraduates are really taken by the fact that it's like, you know, you keep talking about the Tsar all the time, Professor Wcislo. The Tsar's hardly ever even mentioned in Anna Karenina, despite the fact that there is this sort of high society world that extends far beyond simple notions of fascism.
You taught me about in the last semester, right?
I teach every year.
Oh, I'm just having a
It's
blast.
the best.
Oh, it's just, it is the best. It's the best. I was
And it's
chicken.
actually wonderful to think about bureaucracy too. You know, Tolstoy thinks that bureaucracy is meaningless.
Yeah.
Yes, and can't even be bothered to describe what they actually do.
Alexei Karenin is actually a major sub-character of Tales of Imperial Russia. I mean, basically, I use Karenin to kind of get at the daily life of a bureaucrat in ways that would have otherwise been completely impossible.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful stuff. These subcultures, the imperial court and high society, bureaucratic officialdom, and there the Bakhmut archive is really wonderful because this Gakantov material basically is a close record of the proceedings of the imperial cabinet that's not sanitized. And the problem with this stuff in St. Petersburg is that it's always passed around, and everybody gets to delete from the record anything they don't like. So by the time you get it as a historian, it's junk, because most of the conflict has been taken out. This guy, who's the chief recording secretary, is actually keeping his own set of notes. And even better, they go into emigration, and his wife, for whatever reason, spends the time transliterating the otherwise indecipherable handwriting into a typed manuscript. So there's actually a set of notes for bureaucratic officialdom that runs from the outbreak of war in the summer of 1914 all the way into late 1916.
Could I pause?
Sure.
It's a sort of question, interpretive historiography question. We spoke about autocracy once before, or many times before, but this project. Whenever I've had students come in here, I've always said, well, do what you want. But we still don't have a good history of Nicholas, right? Nicholas and those families, and they all say, no, I'm not interested, right? Which is fine. I mean, they're still wrong here. But you told me once. You see, the problem with studying Nicholas is that we have a lot about autocracy as a system. For instance, we have the Imperial cabinet, for example, but we have almost nothing left about Nicholas himself. And that the way it all functions is verbal, and he's everywhere but nowhere. Meaning, both Nicholas and Alexandra are involved in all sorts of decisions. They're receiving reports, they're pronouncing. They may do, Saglasna, or something, or something like that. But there's actually no record of Nicholas himself. You're telling me. So there's a difference, it seems to me, between studying Nicholas and Alexandra and studying autocracy as an institution. So when you say autocracy, that you either do 14 to 18, the autocracy, what are we talking about, really? Is it the cabinet?
No, no. It's the imperial court, bureaucracy, military officers, a congeries of parties of общественные деятели and business, and possibly, although I'm not sure I can get there, the church. And that basically, I think, writ large, is the autocratic system.
And this is we're trying to get to this term, like you're thinking elite, for example.
Yeah.
And you need something other than autocrat in order to explain what it is.
Well, the autocrat is, basically is the centerpiece of this system, and the glue that in fact holds it together. And one of the things that you see in 1917 is that the key moment in the revolution is his resignation, is the abdication. Basically all of these groups that I've just mentioned are astounded by the fact that he's stepping out. It's like Ivan Grozny going off to Alexandrovsk, and withdrawing from the state altogether. Officers are stunned by the disappearance of the emperor to whom they've sworn their allegiance. Bureaucrats who already have protested Nicholas's adoption of the Supreme Command in the summer of 1915 is a really key moment on the road to the collapse of the system. Because as far as civilian officials are concerned, there's already a kind of voyevlasti, a dual power existing between the civilian and military sectors of the empire. by administrative fiat at the outbreak of the war in 1914, the military high command, and through the military high command, the military bureaucracy, controls all territories and all administrative decision-making in territories of the front, the near front, the near rear, right? That is the area directly behind the fighting, as well as key administrative sectors deeper in the imperial capital, Moscow, other major industrial cities. As the front recedes, more and more of the interior comes under direct military rule. There is a kind of duoevlastia that's actually remarked increasingly in these bureaucratic proceedings, and when Nicholas actually assumes the supreme command in the summer of 1915, this to bureaucratic officialdom is at the beginning of what the Minister of Finance, Barth, calls the beginning of personal rule. And there's a whole argument to be made here about the role that Nicholas plays in a systemic collapse. And so autocracy for me. That's right. Yeah. So ultimately, you know, sort of autocracy is not the crown, and not the court, and not the autocrat, but it is a system of affinity groups and subcultures that are plugged together into an autocratic system. And hence, at the moment, the difficulty of kind of coming up with a word, because elite isn't actually a word that you find in the vocabulary of the time. And Wcislo doesn't get at it, right? And so it's difficult to actually find the term that in fact captures elite. But if you're interested ultimately, and I am, in an organizational study of autocracy, I mean, it becomes a question of how do you in fact get at an understanding of the ways in which these various subcultures intersect with, or don't intersect at all with, each other, right? So that the book ultimately has, at the moment, and I think in this order, 4 or 5 chapters. It depends on the church, right? It starts with, as one would expect, it actually starts with a chapter on the royal couple and the imperial court culture in which they're ensconced. It's followed by a chapter on bureaucratic officialdom. And it's a bureaucratic officialdom whose history, I mean, all of this is so preliminary that I'm almost, I'm almost ashamed to be talking about it. It starts with a bureaucratic officialdom that regards itself at one and the same time as incredibly innovative, because if you look at the tasks that they're being forced to confront, they have no notion of a home front in 1914. They have no notion of the mobilization of national resources to fight this industrial war in 1914. These ideas all come online as a war, which we know sort of like, at ABC level of cliche, a war that was supposed to only last for weeks or months, dragged on year after year after year with people promising victory the next time around. And that officialdom actually raises some very interesting questions in this second chapter on bureaucracy about the degree to which patterns of early Soviet rule are being established. Certainly you've found this kind of stuff already. Early Soviet rules being established in these last years of tsarist governance. But at the same time, what you also see in a countervailing and I think ultimately predominant way is a bureaucratic officialdom that rests, not surprisingly, on precedent. Past performance, in fact, is a guarantee of future success. To sort of play around with the term that financial advisors will always throw at you when you put your money into their mutual funds. Well, of course, Vanderbilt's such a wealthy institution, we're just swimming in it. Can we delete things that are sent over the internet?
That's the best part.
So bureaucratic officialdom. Then a chapter on their analog, which is the public activists of actually, the party leaders, and the business elites, all of whom are intermingled with each other in ways that vie for power, in ways that are ignorant of the situation that actually exists with the crisis situation existing in the country. All of whom ultimately, in fact, there's an interesting, as far as bureaucrats are concerned, Lenin's not the real threat, Georgy is. I mean, a moderate Octoberist, right? Or Radzianko, the president of the Fourth Duma, right? He's the real radical. This is before you even get to Milyukov. And in the retrospective memoirs of bureaucrats, when they look at ultimately their chief competitors, they see a very systematic drive for power on the part of these public activists to displace them at the side of the emperor. That whole world and the responsibilities that it bears and the functionality that it brings to bear on a question of systemic collapse also bears future investigating. There's an old article that our mentor wrote a long time ago called "The Parties and the State," and it's a piece still worth reading today. That, for my purposes, has a lot less to do with the state and a lot more to do with political leaders in emerging and new political culture that really kind of only comes to public fruition in 1905 and in 1906. And one of the chief arguments in that piece is that these party leaders themselves, part and parcel of an intelligentsia tradition that focused on the elimination of absolutism and the disassociation of Russia from the absolutist state and absolutist rule. That singular preoccupation left them less intellectually capable to articulate both the transition that would take place from an absolutist to a post-absolutist politics, and also less intellectually capable to imagine, basically, after the transition, the world that in fact would exist, what a post-absolutist politics would in fact look like. Then the question of the church and whether I'm capable of doing the church, but then ultimately the military and the officer corps. Because they, for me, absolutely are ultimately key to this to this collapse. Part of this emerges also from Witte, who was arguably, with Pyotr Stolypin, the most capable statesman of the late Imperial era, who actually believed in the creation of a Rechtsstaat, who, in fact, not only thought about but produced 2 decades worth of policies to in fact create a modern industrial imperial polity that would in fact compete with the winds of nationalist ideologies drifting Europe in the early 20th century. And the one thing that Witte, after Alexandra, the one thing that Witte was constantly obsessed with was what he called военное государство. Because ultimately, Russia to him wasn't a civil society, and if you will, a гражданское государство. It was a militarized state. You can think about this symbolically. Ultimately, the emperor rarely appeared in civilian dress unless he was visiting his relatives in Western Europe. But when you saw him, he was always in military garb. And Nicholas, of course, like his father before him, actually favored the garb of the peasant soldier, or of the colonel, that is, of the officer and the simple soldier, to a much greater extent. From the symbolic to, I don't know, railroad construction.
When did it start that the tsars started to mostly appear in military?
Alexei, back in the 17th century, he started. Surprisingly. And then Peter Constantine.
And I think, and the female empresses of the 18th century as well. You know, I mean, basically there's some famous artistic portraiture of Catherine dressed in guards uniforms when she's.
And other European monarchs didn't do this.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, I think they actually did, and that, you know, if you actually in fact look at these monarchical houses, they're all ultimately tied to symbolically the power of the state. And the power of the state ultimately always rests on military power.
And Edward was able to cultivate this bourgeois, comfortable middle class image also, where you put on his tweed.
That's what I was
Edward.
confused about, so I was late, yeah.
But Albert was in uniform, wasn't he?
I mean, I was, looking at stuff this morning, trying to track down like nine or 10 or 11 children exactly, and on Google, and so there were pictures of Victoria and Albert, and while they're dressed typically, if you're to take the imagery that pops up in the Google box as authoritative at all, and I recognize it's not, there's photography of them in civilian dress, but there's also artistic portraiture of them of him in military garb and her.
She had her own set of
right
symbols that she was deploying.
But I mean, even if you think about sort of the British royals today, on certain public occasions, she'll appear in military dress. In the Russian context, though, this is really central, I think, symbolically. Or you can actually move from symbolism to objectivity and look at railroad construction. In a huge fight is basically, do you build railroads for commercial purposes, or do you build them for strategic purposes? And Witte actually does a pretty reasonable job when you look at this in detail of, in fact, turning railroads to commercial use, but is constantly being assaulted by the War Ministry for expenditures on strategic railroads, on double tracking, on the use of a railroad system ultimately for strategic needs. And it's this, in times of peace, that leads him to talk about the militarized state, the vojenное государство. Well, by the time you get to the First World War, there are hints of this already in the Russo-Japanese War. By the time you get to the First World War, there is no other state imperative that's more overwhelming than victory. You hear, what's amazing about reading this stuff is that they all believe in the final victory. They're constantly officers, court bureaucrats, officials in the Ministry of Finances or Interior, public politicians. They all hold to the idea that we can't do this now, but after the war we will. And there is a belief in the sense of the longevity of this system. So you ultimately come back to officers and the role that officers actually play in a system that while it is still autocratic, is also becoming increasingly militarized.
And they basically destroy the civilian economy. They take over the transport system. They impose prices, fixed prices, which have nothing to do with inflation. And so the old argument is that they destroy the exchange economy and don't have an allocation system to replace it. Precisely because the military trumps. It's a zero-sum game in their mind. You either do military or you do civilian.
But I venture Germany becomes the closest analog that this is true in each one of the combatant countries. And it's here ultimately that two really interesting things happen, I think, in terms of the military. I mean, one is that the least, and this is an old canard, the least industrialized of all the major combatants is the first one to break. But it breaks only a year prior to Germany breaking as well, right? Because all of the resources of national economies are being mobilized to wartime purposes, and ultimately this means that civilian sectors are being let dry of those resources. Transportation, I mean, it's a long list. The second thing that it seems to me is really apparent is this, again, traditional view of the disconnect between officers and soldiers in the Imperial Army. Soldiers, you know, I mean, the argument about February 1917 is soldiers mutiny. Right? I mean, ultimately, what happens in Petrograd is a soldier's mutiny. But soldiers, of course, are mutinying across Europe by 1916 and 1917. Given the fact that sort of tactics and strategy and the technological means of warfare are so completely out of whack. The meat grinder effect, which you actually find people talking about, it's never the meat grinder, but it's an unending source of manpower that flows into the army. A wonderful, a really incredible memoir by a regimental commander of the Priorzhensky Guards I was telling you about the other day, a guy named Zubov, who serves in the Guards as a company commander, captain, and eventually makes it to the rank of colonel, from the outbreak of the war in 1914 until the collapse of the army in the summer of 1917. And he details the way in which his regiment is constantly being replenished with March battalions, they're called. So you basically bring up groups of soldiers who have been called up through the reserve system. You bring them up to the front, you distribute them out, akin to the American Army in the Vietnam War era, where replacements actually are not being brought up as full units. Basically, you're just being brought up and distributed out into existing frontline organizations. By the time you get to 1917, the reserve system actually is drawing on people who we know who basically managed somehow or another to get out of the draft in the first place, out of conscription. So, you know, I mean, skilled labor is being called up and all the rest. But one of the things that becomes really loud and clear in the memoir literature is that the people who are being called up in 1917 are 40-year-old men. I mean, men who, the people who were in the garrisons in Petrograd in 1917 are not really young punks who are a la Orlando Figes who were rioting and all the rest, right? They're old guys who, of course, have the most to lose. I mean, granted, you and I basically look at 40 and don't call it old, but you know what I'm saying, right? Older men who actually have much more to lose and whose actions in mutinying are absolutely rational in that sense. And the third thing to say about the Army is the caste-like isolation of the officer group, which, in fact, it's not so much which is ignorant of and abusive toward the enlisted man, but entertains, as does the emperor, a level of idealized cliche about the enlisted soldier. Or peasant monarchism exists in ways that it's surprising to still see. Yeah.
How are they able to sustain that level of delusion so late? I mean, there's all kinds of information circulating. There's ethnography. There are writers writing about what peasants actually think. You know, participating in the economy. There's labor mobility. How can they still believe this?
They fight. You know, the first answer that they fight late into through the campaigns of 1916 and are prepared to fight again through 1917. So, you know, I mean, basically, soldiers continue to show to the colors, right? Now, you know, how they're forced to the colors, how they're recruited, how they're brought to the front, that's certainly where I'm at the moment in terms of this research project. I mean, I'm stumbling around and not really easily ready to answer your question. I think a lot of it also has to do with schooling. So, you know, I mean, there's a good deal of these. When you think about an officer caste, you know, they're all a product of military academies, but not West Point, but sort of, you know, the Citadel, right? Places like that.
Well, that's actually
Let's roll it down.
Yeah.
that's actually one institution that is controllables. Whereas he's talking about the whole system of
Yeah.
Военные училища, they're called, and sort of, I mean, there's one a memoir that was at the Hoover of one such military academy in Vilna, and this is filled with, they don't. The memoir doesn't talk about what they studied. I mean, the memoir talks about military student life, right? Being a cadet, the traditions of being a cadet. A day in late May, early June, when every newly commissioned cadet officer takes the oath of allegiance to the reigning sovereign. The sort of annual ritual of training and summer camp and garrison life. Absolutely. That in a lot of ways I think is probably, and ironically so, given the death rates that are taking place in the war, is if anything accentuated and emphasized further by the conditions of war itself. And that officerstvo really becomes, I think, a key component in the system's collapse, because the system itself has become so militarized by 1917. Straight down to, and this is the Bark memoir, a minister of finance who writes he's fluent in English. So what's really interesting about this guy's memoir in the first instance,
Sir Peter Bark. Right?
Yeah, it's written in the language of constitutional monarchy. So to actually, in fact, not have to translate out of Russian and into English, but actually to read a Russian writing in fluent English and referring to, the chairman of the Council of Ministers. There isn't a prime minister in the Russian government, in the autocratic system. He's the chairman of the Council of Ministers. He's the premier, right? The Council of Ministers is the cabinet, right? The Duma is the parliament. I mean, all of this is actually written in this style, but what Bark sees when Nicholas goes off to the front in the summer of 1915, Bark launches into a whole analysis about the emergence of a system of personal rule. Now, we have a very old friend and colleague at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I don't know if David's actually out there watching this, who's written a classic monograph on what he calls united government in Russia. The ministerial system in the Russian state is such that each minister reports individually to the emperor. Thus, the emperor, who is an autocrat and by definition is therefore arbitrary, his arbitrariness is actually captured in a governing system where each minister actually reports directly to the boss. And isn't necessarily ever required until 1905, 1906 to actually sit at a table with all the other ministers and tell the group what it is organizationally that they're in fact up to. As part of the deal to broker the revolution of 1905 and create the October Manifesto and a state Duma, the other part of this plan is to create a cabinet, a system of united government. And Witte is the architect of this plan, and the idea here is to constrain a notably arbitrary and crazy Nicholas II. The cliche about whom is be the last person to talk to him, because that will be the decision that's actually taken. The last voice in his ear is the way that the decision will actually go. So the only way to constrain that, to regularize government, is to entrap him in a system of cabinet government, which, as long as there's a powerful chairman of Witte, or after Witte, a Stolitman, this works. But by the time we get to 1915, Nicholas, who's convinced of this fantasy that, his duty as sovereign is to be with his troops. And in the summer of 1915, of course, the Imperial army has retreated from Poland altogether and is basically setting up defensive lines inside Russian territory proper. So Nicholas actually departs the capital and goes to Stavka, goes to the front, and takes over the supreme command of the army. He becomes the supreme commander, freaking out the cabinet and his high officials, because he literally is departing he physically is departing the civilian state. This is already a time when Rasputin is whispering in Alexandra's ear and all the rest. Bark takes us out of the realm of rumor and anecdotal innuendo, and actually tries to systematically approach it as the beginning of a period of personal rule. Because Nicholas is more comfortable in the militarized state, he's more comfortable in the military role, he's more comfortable with military commanders, he finds himself more comfortable with, however fantasized this is, with the simple peasant soldier, so he is with his soldiers, than he is with being a part of the entire civilian career, reality, ultimately, right? And so you find yourself with fantasy and reality as well.
I just have a general question, which is, during the First World War, how much did they refer back to 1812, and then they try to, mobilize that as a fantasy model? I know they did during World War II all the time. And if they didn't, why not? Was it because it wasn't an invasion? Was it because things fought in kind of no space?
To a degree, the best thing I've found on this so far, and I'm working on this now, I hope, as an article, is correspondence between one of the front commanders, whose name is Frank Wcislo, who is the Zhukov of the First World War Army, and probably one of the few successful military commanders, and his wife, who's a nurse, and spends most of her time either in Kiev or in Moscow, because he's commander of the Southwestern Front. And that correspondence is really amazing. I mean, it's amazing at a whole variety of levels. But thinking of that, there's not really any analog to prior military experience, and possibly 1812's in there, the retreat, and that kind of thing. But there's for him, she wants to surrender, or she doesn't want to surrender. She wants it to stop, and perhaps basically. This is gendered. She is a nurse. She's in civilian areas. As far as he's concerned, she's less capable and strong and stoic. He, on the other hand, sort of references to a much greater degree of kind of religious fatalism, as he finds himself sort of, he early on, within the first 4 to 6 weeks. I was just looking at these notes yesterday again. By the time you get, they go into combat in August, and his letters back, he's constantly writing to her. And by the time
14,
he's in the offensive against the Austrians. So he's winning.
He's winning battles.
Yeah,
the war's being lost.
He's winning. But the thing is that the war is being fought in these early days, in particular, under the idea that you can outmaneuver the other side by moving masses of men around in open fields. And so there's a whole language that's being developed here about, sort of entrenchment, clawing into the ground. So you get the sense of soldiers running around, and the description in particular, which is repetitive, of German artillery fire, it's hell. It's sort of high-powered explosives raining shrapnel down on masses of men in the open. So the death totals here are really, as we know, they're really high and astronomical. He, within the first 6 weeks, starts running out of metaphors to describe what he's, rivers of blood, masses of dead. He loses the ability to describe what's actually there. So that rather than 1812 or General Winter, it's kind of a religious fatalism that dictates hanging on to victory, and then ultimately a belief that eventually comes down simply to victory against the enemy, and a war of civilizations. It's all inside this kind of mentality of a militarized state.
He believes in a war of civilization.
He does, against Germans, against barbarism, the deployment of the language of the subhuman against the enemy, the pig, the barbarian, the brute, about Germans, as they, and part of this is that the slaughter that these people are in fact witnessing. And that's when you also then come back to sort of, masses of men who are being fed into the system. By 1915, they're going into battle without even armaments. So you come ultimately to organizational failure, I suppose. And these are, and I'm just going to tick them off real quickly and then I'll stop. First impressions after summer 2013 research, right? And the first one of them is is leadership and the lack thereof. But it's actually leadership that, in fact, is, and I guess I come back to this point, leadership that's crafted in terms of a fantasy world that has very little access to a relationship with reality at all. What is really striking is a sense, and a generational analysis here I think becomes key. Nicholas is still, even in the First World War, a relatively young man. Brusilov is 60, his wife is 50. The people that you're actually talking about in this elite structure are view themselves, of course, as members of a cutting-edge world. They're young, they're modern, they're knowledgeable. They are fit to rule and fit to manage. And what's most striking about their leadership of the system that they find themselves in is their lack of comprehension of the people that they either rule or manage. An unbelievable emphasis in this organization on hierarchy, status, and subordination. So when you read these memoirs and you look at the cultural tropes to be found in them, soldiers obey. Peasants are subservient and loyal. Workers are necessary but controlled. Youth are wild but manageable. Noble and court elites are entitled. Officers are brave and loyal. The language of hierarchy, the language of status, and the language of subordination is assumed at a basic cultural genetic code DNA level. In this organization. Thirdly, the attraction, the siren call of status, power, and influence. Especially in a hierarchical system where status and subordination are of such import, you find yourself being reminded repeatedly in reading these things. What I was told a very long time ago when I was still a graduate student and went to the Soviet Union for the first time, and I wanted to work on local reform and bureaucrats. And the advisor that I worked with, a incredible historian, Valentin Dyakin, now deceased, said to me, well, "Why do you want to study bureaucrats and policy? They don't care. They don't care about that. They only care about power and, by extension, money. And they'll do anything for power and money. So it's like, why are you wasting your time doing this?" Well, I mean, I wrote the book anyhow. But in that sense, the attraction, the siren call of status, power, and influence, which I suppose you see on display as well. Next is a term that's all over the literature of managerial and organizational studies. It's called silos. Academics know this far less than management types do. But basically, if you're in a literature department or a history department, both literature and history scholars have understandings of the other that oftentimes are quite negative. Now that might not be true at NYU, and it might not be true at Vanderbilt, and actually in an era where interdisciplinarity is becoming ever more pronounced. Those sorts of academic silos, existing paradigms of people, ideas, and assumptions about the other, those sorts of silos are being leveled. But as we were joking, if you're a newly minted Ph.D., you really don't want to be appointed into an interdisciplinary program because your tenure will be decided on the basis of really old and existing departmental paradigms, right? So,
the
last thing we were joking about this. The last thing you want to be is, somebody who's basically has a joint PhD in history and anthropology, and then end up being put into some sort of history anthropology program because the question then is going to be, well, so are the anthropologists or the historians going to decide on whether or not you get tenure, and who's going to write for your file, and all the rest. Those are silos. In the Russian context, and when I saw the word, it was just like, man, are you kidding me? Podvedomstvenost, it's called in Russian. Vedomstvo, a department, right? Pod, literally subordinate to, and then nos, turning this into some sort of grand conceptual schema, right? Which doesn't translate very well as silo-ness, although it does translate better as particularism. It does convey a sense of some knutnost, as we were saying that the other day, and does actually capture, even if you think about the way that I've structured the chapters, the court, officialdom, общественные деятели, and officer corps, right? 4 very distinct subcultures or affinity groups, words that I've been stumbling around for the last hour plus. All of which, though, constitute silos. And the problem of siloism in this regime, if there's a connection to that larger literature out there, if you don't read Adam Bryant from the corner office on the front page of the business section of the Sunday Times, you should, or you should start doing it. It has a lot to say about contemporary American life, that or The Office. Silos kill this regime. And it is pronounced. Two more things that I'm done now. One is precedent, routine, and tradition. I already talked about, when the war is over. When the war is over, precedent and past greatness are predictors of future success in this system, and particularly at a time of wholesale and massive transformation in every imaginable way. That clinging to precedent and routine and tradition is deadly. But let's face it, innovation is uncertain and difficult, and routine and tradition are much more permanent. And despite the amount of innovation that's actually going on in the system, and there is quite a bit of it, ultimately it is precedent and routine that went on. And then finally is, and I mentioned this at several different points, a disconnect between vision and reality that's never as pronounced as it is during the war years. When you read in the Imperial archives, and it barely matters when, one of the things that you oftentimes see are grand projects. I mean, I've studied bureaucratic reform, and so you're constantly looking at, so how can the system be changed? And there's always a piece at the end about the money available to change it, the money available to actually, in fact, do it. And it's there always that you always would get this sense of a contrast between vision and reality. The grander the vision, the more expensive the reality. And, here writ large, if you think about officers and soldiers, for example, the contrast between the idealized world that is envisioned and the actual reality that's there is striking. So that in the memoirs, finally, we'll talk about, for officers in particular, the shock of the 3 weeks following the application of the enrich. The shock that soldiers actually, in fact, would rebel. But the real shock being that officers would, in fact, abandon their oath and begin to appear with red cockades in their hands. And it's as if, you read this and say, you must be kidding. How could any of that be shocking? How could you not see that coming? And yet, sort of like this contrast between vision and reality is indeed quite pronounced. So with that, I'll stop the ramble.
And so you have, I mean, you laid it out in sort of, so I have a short-term, sort of an immediate observation, and then a long, bigger question. And the purpose of all this also is to, to think it through with you. And in terms of the silos, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that. By silos, you mean actually like
paradigm. I mean, a paradigm that comes complete with both ideological, administrative, and cultural structures.
And it's self-contained.
Absolutely.
Yeah, isn't it one that they're not connected to each other?
Correct.
Right, there's no.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, oftentimes people will talk about in managerial studies the silos overflowing. If you think about interdisciplinarity, and so basically, sort of what, in fact, intermingles outside the silos, that's the interesting and creative place in which, or even think about Thomas Kuhn and Kuhn's notion of scientific revolution, right, and paradigm shift.
Can all be accommodated, right?
Correct.
So look, if you go back to Leo Hamson, our mutual advisor, or someone like Al Weber, I mean, their answer was very clear. I mean, Leo in particular would go purple if you tried to suggest to him that the silos were somehow connected. You missed the entire point of imperial history. He told me this more than once, and he went purple as he was telling me. It was anathema to suggest, in other words, that there would be any connection between these different things. His whole explanation for the collapse of the imperial polity was that it was fragmented, right? And it was a caste mentality pretty much every level of society. And so to him, it's the rest is like an enigma. The rest just follows. By 1917, when it's supposed to be coming together, it's actually falling apart. Right? And then Al Weber would say, a related argument, which is that each of these things were self-contained, but they had no grounding in anything else, in any other part of society. The sedimentary society, in other words. Nobody could find roots anywhere and sort of looking in the other direction. And so it's all consistent there, but they're not cultural historians, and to some extent you are. And so you're trying to look at those things which are not institutional only, exclusively. I mean, you're an institutional historian also, but you're also a cultural historian. And you're grappling, I think, in useful ways, with something that they would not grapple, which was, is there some sort of invisible thread? Is there something else? Invisible thread is the term used by Chuck Steinwell. That there are things that you can't really prove, you can't really trace them bureaucratically, and yet everyone understands that they're a part of something. And they might be explicit if you look in the right places. And so you, to the extent that you're also a cultural historian, I think are trying to grapple with something new, an imperial culture. You keep telling you were talking about it yesterday when you were lecturing Vanderbilt, but there is an imperial culture here. And culture is something which doesn't lend itself to institutional study necessarily. So that, just to give you an example, if you were to look at one or another high-level bureaucrat, like Wcislo, he becomes Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, and he was Minister of Finances before Bank. And so Wcislo, if you look at him as an institutional figure, is married to the Ministry of Finances, and he can only make sense in the Ministry of Finances. But as soon as he leaves work, he'll go off to a club. He would go to a baptism of somebody who's from a different ministry. He's friends with oppositionists. He's friends with the leader of the cadet finance subgroup, right, with liberals, with the October support. And so there are other things going on which are part of like a local imperial culture. The best thing I would read for that would be Alienino, descriptions of what it was to be living in Tiflis right before the revolution, when people from different walks of life are coming together at certain occasions, like the balls, like the schools, the French academies, things like that. Of course, this guy never lived these things, but side of and so that would be my observation in terms of meaning you're reaching for something else. But the big question, I think, is still this problem of autocracy, right? And how do you describe it? So you, as I'm listening to you, you're telling two parallel stories, and they don't necessarily meet. And where they would meet would be in February 1917. But they are parallel stories, and one of them is this term you're grappling with, which is Общество, образованное общество, цензовое общество, elite, you say. And so fine. But there's something, in other words, it bonds. there's something systemic, there's something institutional, there's an imperial culture in the most general and least specific terms. And that this is there, and the reason why I think everyone's surprised about N17 is not only because they're married to their own institutions and can't see what's going on around them, but because they really do pertain to, they really do belong to an imperial culture, an imperial civilization, in other words. And to them, this is real at the same time. This is where they exist. This is where they've been brought up. You're right, they haven't met Nicholas, the vast majority of them. And they're not at the court necessarily. And that's on the one side. But on the other side, there's the reality of autocracy, unlimited autocracy. The term which is used all the way to 1917. The best I can tell is that if you know better than I do, but if you look at the events of February and March 1917, it's basically a coup. So there is a revolution. But what happens? The leaders of the Duma, who are part of the society, by the way, this imperial society, the Zienka, all this garbage, the wolf, they're a part of the imperial culture. They're not outside of it. And they're scrambling to see how they can save something because as they see it, things are going to the dollars, and we're going to have a Bund, another Bund. We're going to have another hideous peasant uprising and work uprisings and destroy everything. So how do we salvage it? And for this, we're in conversation with, for the first time, the inaugural staff. And they go to the generals. And they tell the generals, partly sincerely and partly insincerely, because they would like to see a limited armament. They would like to see something change. They don't like Nicholas. They think Nicholas is a fool, and he's bad for the empire. But they also take a step beyond that and tell the generals that if you don't get rid of Nicholas, the whole thing is going to collapse. And the generals probably sincerely believe it. They're convinced when the Zienka comes and tells them this. And the Zienka is lying to them, by the way. Because the Zienka and the wolf. And so they agree, and when they pull their support from Nicholas, and they go to Nicholas and say, listen, if the game's over, you have to abdicate. Nicholas realizes he has no future. He abdicates. But it was a coup. So it brings together these two threads, one of which is the institutional, the other which is still the personal. It's still an unlimited autocracy. And it's still possible, because it's an autocracy, to stage a coup. Right? If you get rid of Nicholas, you've carried out a coup. Whereas you couldn't do that if it were a constitutional monarchy, for example. You see what I'm saying? The game would have taken place in a different institution. It would have taken place through procedures, through precedents and whatnot. Here you can have a coup because it's an autocracy still. And this, to me, is what you seem to be describing is the moment when these two threads meet and the system breaks. And it breaks because of one person. Does that make sense?
The choice that's actually on the table in these days is exactly the same choice that Nicholas confronts in 1905. So the choice that he's actually being confronted with is compromise or dictatorship.
Yeah.
And he actually, in fact, makes a move that he's incapable of making in 1905, which is dictatorship. I mean, so he actually, in fact, he orders troops into the capital. He opts for dictatorship, and then, of course, he then turns around when he's confronted with the reality of that decision, the unavailability of troops, the refusal of Duma politicians to go along with this particular view of the world, the incapacity to actually instill any kind of order in the capital, where police and military power is disappearing altogether, and it's having opted for dictatorship, it's then at that point that he, in fact, opts for, I guess, in your view of things, a different form of dictatorship.
We're talking when?
These days.
February.
Mm-hmm. The 5 days. Including, actually, a dispatch of units of the Prerevolutionary Guards to train stations to be moved into the city. With even some talk early on, and this basically starts running into detail away from the conceptual picture that you're putting forward, that Krzyżanowski's name is put forward as a possible chair of the Council of Ministers in late 1915, early 1916, and that he insists on changing the way in which the military is garrisoned in the city, in order ultimately to kind of foresee the possibility of military incursion in the city as a way of maintaining order.
Conceptually, as we go down the track, how much, so it seems like kind of like setting up the picture of how the cities run it, when you have kind of the application, sort of where would democracy be for this having? You have these chapters that are kind of silos. It's like 17 like that. 17 like after each chapter.
No, I mean, because I think that 818 is the point is the chronological end piece of each one of the chapters, right? It becomes, with the imperial court and royals, it ends with execution, right? With the military officers, there's some question about whether the 18 is actually a stopping point. You would have to possibly make that point. All these people, and then army disintegrates in the summer of 1917. Many of these officers, hence they're in the Witte, and especially the Hoover, they go off and join the volunteer army, right? So that many of them are fighting through 1918. With public politicians, their story plainly continues at least until the October seizure of power, but because there's very little boundary line between that and civil war politics that then ensue, and those of them who are still around, and many of these actors, in fact, are, with Zanko is, and some of his materials at the Hoover, Media Club, etc. So. For me, the question also becomes, and then is that you're putting your finger on a writer's problem. Do you write this as 4 separate essays that have to themselves be intermingled, right? I mean, because Yanni's point is actually not only a conceptual problem, but it's also a writer's problem as well. So do you actually end up telling this story 4 different ways, somehow or another connecting them in the reader's mind? And that's a technical problem. I'm nowhere close to it at the moment, right? So I'm not raising it as anything more than, if you're going to describe enclosed caste-like groups, and then because the kind of connectivity that's being described here, or what overflows the silos and is actually to be found in the interstices among these silos, the interconnectivity, is in fact there, right? Conversations between Duma politicians and bureaucrats take place, especially in 1950, right? To a much greater, right, all the way through, but especially, with a whole set of reformist bureaucrats who really are kind of the last great throat, Krivoshin and company, this ministerial crisis in the summer of 1915. The back and forth between business and government, before and after the events of the downfall of before and after March and February, March of 1917. Those sorts of connections are there as well. So each one of the 4 chapters ultimately, in fact, would you'd be able to talk about interconnectivity as well. And that writer's challenge, I haven't quite figured out. So the other way of going at it, of course, is that it then becomes a chronological narrative, in which each one of the 4 groups becomes involved, right, in chapters that are organized chronologically, but that becomes chaos.
What if you have another service? So again, this is why I thought Anne was so relevant to what Frank is. Stop me as soon as I'm wrong, but what Anne is studying is both knowledge, right? In this case, it's local knowledge and economic knowledge, which is playing some part. If you look at it in those terms, and it's no longer bureaucrat versus writer versus intelligent, they come together on some level, at the local level. In particular, in the revisions and in the inhabiting of a local space. And if you look at it, from the point of view of Pienza, there's not a huge difference between the bureaucrats and the Zemstva activists, the marshal, the nobility, Even the merchants sometimes, they come together in certain levels for Duma elections, meaning the municipal government elections. They come together for administering certain institutions, the quasi-governmental institutions like sobriety commissions, credit commissions, all these are things that I'm most familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so Anne's looking at it as local, although writ large, right? But the methodological question that she poses and is useful, I think, is to say, well, how do you begin to reconceive them not as lust versus obsessiveness, but how do you conceive of it as some sort of well, again, we're grappling for this term. Wcislo?
Wcislo probably work for what I'm talking about, but I understand why it doesn't necessarily work when you're talking about real elites, central elites.
Although when you're looking at local societies, I mean, there's some really interesting stuff both here and in California. The people, the folks that you're describing right now, I'm thinking Witte.
Yes.
Right. That these are, these are individuals, and you can find, names that aren't necessarily altogether familiar, but people who are landowners with substantial agricultural interests and enough money to actually be engaged in industrial banking or financial dealings of one kind or another, where they're also making money, probably off of rent and interest. Individuals who, because of their family standing, their rank and connectivity, have place in global administration, in museums, land cap, and a variety of commissions, have reserve standing in the military and might actually serve in the military, but not necessarily at the front, but in mobilization or in the draft and conscription, and sort of draft mobilizing forces and whatnot into the armed forces, who serve as provincial administrators as well. So it's not, in that sense, it's not everybody in these groups, but it's a particular group. I mean, but when you get to those people, because their analog is, I don't know, think about Biesi and Dostoevsky and that little provincial society. I mean, the word elite applies there as well, although it wouldn't necessarily be the word that you would use.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that interests me, because I'm not enough of a historian probably to really choose someplace like Pinza and look at what was actually going on among these, say, local elites who maybe were less siloed, because they couldn't be so siloed because there weren't enough of them. But I think what interests me, and this relates to my question about how military officers, for example, were able to be as deluded as they were, what interests me is about these central elites, the real elite elites. What sustains their illusions? Why is it so impossible for them to look outside and see what is actually happening, which other people know is happening in Pinza or wherever? So I'm interested in the way that the stories get told, the stories that they circulate, that make them only able to see where they are.
And it goes beyond physical segregation in that sense, right? So that you're in officers' clubs, you go to officers' restaurants, you basically live in separate quarters away from men, because it also comes to how do you tell stories that sustain the legitimacy of that kind of physical separation.
Right, and how over and over again, if most knowledge is produced in the center and then sort of disseminated, well, then everything's being seen from this particular point of view, and then you get this reproduction of the same trope, which is sort of putting into tsaritsa over and over again, even though it's totally counterfactual. It's not like nothing is going on out here and everything is going on here in the middle. And yet this gets reproduced over and over again in literature particularly. I mean, I think that there's more pushback in, say, the provincial press, or the kind of structures that Jan is talking about, very local elites. But what's amazing to me is how, particularly in high literature, the same story is told over and over again.
So I wonder if the degree to which that sort of connectivity, whether it's sociological and physical, or narrative and conceptual, is because it's a form of innovation, isn't unsettling, and destabilizing, and thus increasingly so dangerous to people who, especially if you buy, whether it's Stalica and Provincia or tradition and precedent, right? That because the latter is ultimately more comforting, that in the same way that an interministerial conference that brings representatives of the parties into non-ministerial institutions to deal with questions of defense, supply, armament,
That's destabilizing.
that are actually, in fact, they're echoes of early Soviet government.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's something to that, and, the analog would be, in a very, very different sphere, would be questions of literary canonization, who gets canonized. Writers, no matter how brilliant they are, who write about local phenomena without their eye on the center, they don't make it to the top. Even, these books, even say, Cheers. They don't make it to the top level. They make it to sort of, and I think it's something about their refusal to see from the point of view that is at a certain point seen as the literary point of view. I don't know how good the analogy is, but.
Well, we're entertaining another possibility, which is, here's problematic because both of us were trained in a certain school of thought,
Right.
which is about structural weakness, and therefore a certain structural almost inevitability. Although we don't call it that. But by the time we get to February 1917, we already know pretty well that why this happened. And to some extent, we make the tacit leap and say, well, not only do we know why it happened, it was going to happen. Leo did this all the time. He denied it, but I think he did it. Right? But what if we were to take a different track and say, well, if you look at it as elites, as cultures, and I like particularly the term imperial cultures, and you did so well in the second book, I think. And if you were to put aside the inevitability of their downfall and treat them as something which was, take them at face value, in other words. There was a certain continuity there, and they were perfectly reasonable to say that this is permanent. But then you switch to the fact that this is still an autocracy, de jure, and it's entertain the possibility, in other words, that it can be brought down by a coup, and the coup could be so effective precisely because it's an autocracy. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. But it also sort of
this is not the conclusion. This is the sort of
it's the midpoint. Because the thing is that, this story just simply doesn't end in 1917. In a way, autocracy, in your framing, autocracy post-March goes floating off for a while. Right? If you really want to be an arch-determinist about it, it comes back in violently so. If you want to be Leonard Shapiro, it comes back in violently so in October, right? But this whole notion of an imperial, the notion not of discontinuity, but of continuity. And imperial culture, of course, allows a study of continuity, or what I guess I would also call innovation. Right? So to what extent actually, in fact, in the war years, and this presentation emphasized less of that, but it's a question that's of interest to me, but I'm just not at a point yet in the research and certainly in the writing to be thinking about continuity and innovation, and the extent to which this conversation is moving in that direction is a mark of that. And I as a factoid, A.D. Golitsyn, left Octoberist, Stolypin, landowner, basically very much, right, an adept of this modernizing, still noble imperial culture, is in 1918 and 1919 in Kharkov, where his estate holding and bank holdings actually are from. He's actually playing the currency markets, and he's buying and selling rubles, gold, and sterling. Right? And he actually, and what the ruble is, he sells paper rubles and buys
I would do that too.
gold and sterling, obviously, right? And this is sort of late 1917, early 1918. And actually, in fact, writes in his memoirs that he got a pretty good deal. Because bankers actually, in fact, are still, they're stuck with lots of rubles, right? And so bankers are looking also to profit. But as the volunteer army drives on Moscow, he sells gold and sterling and buys rubles because he's convinced that when they get there and they seize power in Moscow, right, that the value of the ruble is going to go through the roof, right? So it's a great move to get rid of gold and sterling and buy rubles instead. Now,
so for him, it's not a terminus nodus. For him, this is
because basically, in terms of an imperial culture, and he's actually, in fact, he is at the same time, whether it's with rubles or with gold, he's investing in his agricultural economy. A year after the Bolsheviks come to power.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I have to leave, so
Yeah,
I just
please.
wanted to put in, well, first of all, my plug for the historical novel, and I don't know if you've read Hilary Mantel's 2 books that read, they both won the Booker Prize in their historical novels.
How do you spell that last name?
Mantel, and she wrote these 2 absolutely brilliant historical novels, very thoroughly researched, set in Tudor England, and they're interesting because, you know, usually historical novels are the interface of a family clan and a nation, and here it's really not about a family clan, it's about sort of trying to build a bureaucracy in a pre-modern place. They're really, really, really good books, and if you want to think about historical novels, they're in one piece. Yeah, and the other thing I just wanted to say is that it's interesting to study bureaucracies by looking at Tolstoy, because Tolstoy thought there was nothing stupider in the entire face of the earth, nothing that was a bigger waste of time, a big joke. He thought the law was a joke. And so it's interesting to use him as a source. You know, I mean, I always talk about bureaucracy and the law when it's just good, but making fun of it all the time.
Well, you know, when this goes back to to the earlier book, Witte, this autobiographical manuscript is 2,800 pages long. Part of it's typed and dictated, part of it's actually written. The juicy parts are written and stored in a bank vault in Brussels because, you know, he's convinced that it's going to be confiscated. But he also organizes an enforced retirement because he's cashiered in 1906, the first Duma. He also organizes his personal archive to support the veracity of the document, so his version of it. So it's always interesting, right? So what's in fact in the archive? What does he actually say? And this is a guy who, you know, basically is in important ways running the state. And there's a letter from Tolstoy from 1902. It's actually one of the rare literary artifacts to be found in the archive. There's not really a whole lot.
What was Tolstoy saying?
He accuses him of being a bureaucrat, right? And basically, you know, sort of oppressing the people, and how could he be like this? And the fact was that, you know, his industrial policies were impoverishing the narod, and you know that how could, I think he calls him the tsarist stavlenik or something like this, right? And essentially, how could he do this? But right, he wags a finger at him. Now, you know, the fact that Witte keeps this letter as a memento already says something.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly when I found myself wrestling around with, as I said earlier, you know, wrestling around, so how do you get at the daily life of a bureaucrat? And he had preserved correspondence with his wife in his archive. It was actually in Petersburg, the Imperial archives. And there, you know, you kind of, for the first time, had a glimpse of private life because a lot of it was pillow talk. Although Victorian pillow talk, so I mean it wasn't really all that interesting when you got right down to it. But it opened up the whole question, and so like, where do you go and get this? And it was, well, I mean, obviously, Autocratic, right? Because after all, I mean, you know, Tolstoy basically accused him of being a bureaucrat. And one of the classic descriptions of the daily life, I think, of a czarist official is Autocratic.
Except that Tolstoy empties his work of content. Tolstoy cannot acknowledge that this work might actually affect the world. You know, I mean, which I don't think is true. I mean, I think that bureaucracy actually affects what happens in the world, but Tolstoy cannot do that. But still, you can describe, I think, how a bureaucrat lived hour by hour. This was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.
So I was wondering, so you're talking about 4 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
This is the last thing I have to say.
Okay.
So you're talking about 4 chapters. They tend to be sort of institutional, occupational in terms of work. But at the same time, you're telling us about how these things together may or may not have constituted something bigger. They're larger than the sum of the parts, right? And we'll grab another experiment as we do for this. Why not have the fifth chapter, where we talk about movement and mobilities, centered on particular kinds of institutions, to lay out the possibilities for existing in the same space, as well as the limits, because there were limits. And so what I've noticed is that when I look at certain institutions, there is actually a lot of crossover in the Duma, State Council, press, and so on and so forth. I'll give you a chapter where I talk about this, at length, about how they're always moving and talking to each other. But there are limits also. So that what I found is that they have these clubs, for example. These clubs would be to handle one or another intellectual question or philosophical question. And they all come from everywhere: retired bureaucrats, state council members, Duma members, press, professors, and trade and industry sector. They're all going into the same place and sitting down and talking to each other more or less in the same language, and they completely understand each other. And the fissures are not along the lines of who's in the dark and who's not. It's more along the lines of differences of opinion on the philosophical and political level. So they do come together on that level. But what I notice is that somebody who is currently serving the government never appears at these institutions. They could appear before, they could appear after. Or then take, look at who's in the Duma, or the so-called oppositionists. They're all state servants, retired. Some of them have just been fired from ministry. I keep coming back to Witte. It's fascinating. Nikolai Witte is Minister of Agriculture, and he's fired because he wanted to expropriate gentry land in 1906. Right? And so they fired him. But he's just penned all sorts of things for the government, all sorts of government proposals, then go to the Duma. By the time these measures are then taken to the Duma and deliberated in the Duma, he's in the Duma as a Duma member for the Gdar party, right? Shepherding them through because he wrote them, right? But he's supposed to be the opposition, right? His brother, meanwhile, stays in government service and becomes state Kaznache in 1914 through the war. Right? That's his brother, right? But there are all sorts of issues like this. If you look at any of these people, and they started off in government service, very often in ministries, in justice, internal affairs, and so there are possibilities, but there are limits because then you won't see them appear at any of these things once they enter government service. It's like a faculty member at NYU being promoted into the provost office, and then you never see them again, right? Because they really do become a different caste, right? I hope this is being watched and recorded. But we never see our colleagues. They're lost to us. They're dead, right? They become something else. So, and if you have like a chapter which lays it out, here's an imperial culture.
So limits of possibilities.
Yeah, and novels are pretty good primary source of it, right? But also just the institutions, the clubs, if you are in Tula, you probably go to the same stores, the same benefits. You're members of some of the same clubs. All of you are members of the Noble Assembly, and so on and so forth. So you might consider that as the background to all of this.
That's really interesting.
And I think you'd be particularly good at doing it as well.
I have a question. Do you use the term class to describe elite and all the different subgroups?
I mean, typically not. Although ruling class, governmental class. Partly it's a question of size. So, I mean, if you're talking about an officialdom that numbers, by the time of the war, 900,000 people, a sociological analysis of that is, at this point, completely beyond me, and quite honestly, not of any interest to me. Although there is a literature on this that's somewhat old at this point. But of those 900,000 people, many of them are provincial officials, low-lying clerks, and all the rest of them aren't at all people that I think probably in terms of officialdom that I'm talking about. When the table of ranks is sort of ranks 1 through 8 and occupy ministerial and high provincial position and whatnot. There's also a question of the degree to which they constitute a class, and what would be the criteria on which you would acknowledge and recognize that constituted class. On the basis of economic holding, they are sustained largely by salary, and to a degree that is next to impossible to document the corruption that comes with influence and power. They hold land, and through really into the late imperial years, one of the ways in which noble land that was monopolized and held in 1861 because it served them exclusively by nobles, the way in which it's distributed more broadly in society is via intermarriage, as officials basically marry into these noble and increasingly D-class A families and gain access to property. But that's, I don't know if that property holding is the economic foundation for class as well. And then ultimately the way in which the literature in our field deals with the question of Wcislovia in class also leaves some real interpretive and methodological problems, I think, in terms of actually acknowledging some stratum of the bureaucracy in class terms. Although, and I guess what I'm doing is I'm acknowledging the difficulty of responding to your question. I very cavalierly threw around the word caste in describing bureaucratic officialdom. Class is simply a word that I find. I wrote in the first book. I wrote a lot about the state, about Wcislovia, and the degree to which, in kind of classic sociological terms, imperial society and at least imperial political culture was envisioning imperial society moving in the direction of a class society. I'm very wary of applying that term for all of those reasons to this thin stratum of officialdom. Even though I get that in colloquial and popular parlance, especially today, in the Russian Federation, or for that matter, actually in Eastern Europe, more generally, Soviet and immediate post-Soviet years, it's routinely deployed in that way. So in Oni, a book in Poland that comes out, sort of in the immediate aftermath of the downfall of the communist regime. It captures the whole idea in cultural terms, right? And it kind of assumes that class, which rests on wealth, corruption, stolen property, status, influence, power, that they plainly constitute a ruling class. To argue that in monographic form, just to me becomes very tall and difficult work.
I have a quick question about the book you mentioned. The Royal As is a very interesting book. She had a section on the discussion between the British government and the royal family on whether to give the Tsar and his family asylum. And there seemed to be affection there and regret when they were all murdered. Do you know anything on the basis of how that decision was made?
Cabinet politics is nearly as I understand it.
It was the government that said no.
Right. And that basically is dictated to the British royals. That you're not going to actually at a time when the war is continuing, and there's increasing labor activism in Britain at the time, concern for the war effort and all the rest. The last thing you actually want to do is bring these people into England.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Frank.
Thank
Good luck for the time.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Watch.
Come back.
All right.
Come back. You ready for more?
I'd love to. All right. Thanks a lot.
People will be waiting for us.
Okay.
Just wrap it up.
All right.